Yo, brother, you're at home with a geek. I'm Mark, aka the Little Black Dude. Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here and you love TV shows, movies, comic books, video games, and other things of a geeky nature, mash the subscribe button and be sure to ring my bell to be part of the notification squad. That way you know whenever I have a new video coming out. This is going to be a little bit more ranty, basically, because I really don't have anything planned right this second. I just really felt like sitting down in front of the camera talking to you for a little while. One of the things that I spend most of my time doing when I'm not writing for my videos or, at work or spending time with my family, things like that. One of the things I do more than anything else is I read webcomics. I am a comic book nerd, yes. I love DC to death, but let's be honest, there's a lot that is kind of lacking with a lot of the mainstream comics. And sometimes there needs to be a hole filled, basically. When it comes to the comic book industry, most people concentrate on the superhero comics because those are the ones that everybody knows about. Everybody knows who the X-Men are. Everybody knows about Justice League, Superman, and Wonder Woman, Batman. Everybody loves Batman these days. It makes me laugh all that much. It's because most people thought that Batman was a lame superhero back in the day. Now he's everybody's freaking favorite. I just find that amusing. But there are so many realms to comics that people don't pay attention to because they're not in the public eye all the time. And webcomics really reach into that. You see, for a very long time, up until the internet became a big deal, there were a lot of people that were making indie comics, people who were drawing their own comics and publishing them themselves, usually making drawings and making copies of them on a photocopier and selling the copies that way. Stories that they came up with, characters that they designed on their own, things like that. And oftentimes it wouldn't be superhero stories. It would be slice of life. It would be young adult. It would be something that was a little bit easier for a person to relate to if they just picked up the comic. And those are the kind of webcomics I started out reading. It was a contrast to what I was used to when it came to reading, regular comics. I enjoyed the fact that it was something different, but I liked the fact that it was easier to access. Okay, this goes along with my concept about digital comics, where it's a lot easier to get your hands on stuff. It's a lot easier to get the distribution going. You want to be able to read something right then and right there. You can just go to your web browser. If you have a smartphone, you can go straight to your smartphone and just pick out, a comic to read. But how do you decide what comics to read? Well, that's something that was also made very simple by sites like KeenSpot, Drunk Duck, Top Web Comics, things like that, where there's a gathering of a number of different comics. For example, on KeenSpot, some of the ones that I started out reading were a comic called Sinfest by Tatsuya Ishida. It's a daily comic and has been running since like 1999. It's the travels and traverses of a character named Slick, whose age is indeterminate, but we can tell he's a little bit older, but he looks like a kid. His friend Monique, who he has a thing for, but they're really just good friends. And I'm trying to remember because there's a bunch of different characters, and there's never really a story arc really, but every day is a little bit different. It's 4-panel comic, that kind of thing. It was a really simple thing. It was silly. It was out of the ordinary. It was something different. So it really did work for me at the time when I was reading it, regularly. It's still out there. Surprisingly, I did not think it would be still running after all this time because I have seen a lot of really good comics die. But it was one of the ones that really got me started when it came down to it. Another good one is It's Walkie. That was the one that really got me into reading more of these slice of life indie type webcomics, because it started out as a completely different series. And this is one of the reasons why I like webcomics as much as I do, because the artist can change direction almost on a dime, it seems like. When I first started reading this comic, it was originally called Roomies. Roomies was about some guys in college. Danny and Joe, they were roommates. They grew up together. They ended up going to the same college. Danny was just getting over a breakup with his high school girlfriend, and Joe is the resident man whore. So the two of them just played off each other really well. It was one of those, kind of an odd couple situations. You could tell why they were friends, basically. And I really liked their dynamic, so it made a big difference to me when I was reading this comic, how much of a difference there was between the two of them. But as time went on, the story started to change a little bit. About 3 years into the comic, Joe gets abducted by aliens. And it's kind of like done as a throwaway joke, which I thought was pretty cool, but it kind of didn't fit with the aesthetic, so I was wondering, what is this all about? But it kept coming back over and over again, talking about him being abducted by aliens. And he ended up meeting some other abductees. Come to find out that that was the actual story that the writer was getting to. David Willis, who's done a number of other comics as well, but It's Walkie is the one that introduced me to his work. I followed It's Walkie for literal years. I read it every single day for such a long time. And then it just stopped. It stopped, and I was heartbroken because I loved this comic so much. There was so much in there. All of the characters, Walkie, Joyce, Joe, Dina, Sal, all of the characters that were there were friends of mine by the time the comic had stopped. We got to see each one of them become something else. We saw each person develop from just being a flat stock character to being someone that was more interesting. They had a backstory, they had a past, they had a reason that they acted the way that they did. And it was something that was interesting for me. So when It's Walkie stopped, I had to find something to fill the gaps. So I started looking, and I found a number of comics over time that just showed how big the indie market could really be. If you really try to find a comic that fits your life, that fits what you're interested in, you will find several that just fit into what it is that you're interested in. For example, my daily reading routine includes a comic called Questionable Content, which is basically a young adult slice of life kind of comic, but it deals with a near future version of the Midwest where, in addition to just interesting stuff happening with, indie type people, everyone has access to AIs, which are fairly advanced and quite interesting, many of which have grown as characters over the course of the comic. It's been running since I think about 2003, 2004, so there's a lot of development. And it's a 5-day-a-week comic, Monday to Friday. The author, Jeff Jacques, excellent, excellent artist, and you get to see the progression of his art as time has gone on. His characters have gained a life of their own, to a point where if I'm reading, I'm like, okay, I can imagine, Faye doing this, or I can imagine Martin's reaction on something like this. When you have characters that have enough dimension, you can look at them and say, okay, I think this is how they'd react. And if they do something that's out of the ordinary for them, you can also say, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Why is he acting like that? Why is she doing this? That kind of thing. Retail, which working in retail fits so well. Retail is a newspaper comic that ended up being put on the web. It's from, if I'm not mistaken, King Features. The artist Norm Feudy worked at Gimbals for many years. He had worked in retail, so he's used to these kind of things. He was at different levels. He was a manager, he was an assistant manager, things like that. So he talks about a lot of stuff that happens in retail stores. And working in a retail store, a lot of these things hit home, and it helps me to cope, which is part of the reason why I like comics in the first place, because it's a very easy way to relieve stress and have a little of what's called escapism. The comics in and of themselves can only go so far, which is why I do like webcomics as much as I do, because oftentimes they can be mixed media. For example, one of the things that I enjoy about questionable content is not only does Jeff Jacques do his own work on the comic itself, he also has a I want to say a metal band, but I'm not sure if it's supposedly metal because I haven't listened to the music. But the fact that he does little things with that in addition to the comic, I find that interesting. Dave Willis does art for the Transformers wiki. He's done a lot of the artwork for BotCon as well. They have a monthly comic for a number of the member sites for Transformers fans that he does comics for. It was called Recordicons, if I'm not mistaken, and it is based on a storyline from the IDW run of Transformers called Shattered Glass. Basically, it's a negaverse type thing where all of the Autobots are evil and all the Decepticons are good, things like that. Another of the comics that I read a lot is called Two Kinds. I came across this one literally by accident. I was getting ready to click on a comic on Hiveworks, which is like a multi-comic network that I read a lot of comics from. I was going to click on one of the ones that I just started reading, and I hit Two Kinds by mistake. This is an anthro comic. Anthro is kind of a gray area for people because most people who see comics that star animals, they instantly go to furry. Furry and anthro are two different things, completely different. Okay, anthro is when you have characters that are animal-like, but they often interact with humanoids, things of that nature. Furry is when everybody and everything in a particular world is all animals. But again, most people have the negative connotation when it comes to furry, and I'm not going to get into that now because it's just not something I want to talk about. But Two Kinds is a number of things. It's an anthro comic, but it's also a fantasy comic. It's got a lot of magic going on in it as well. But again, it's a well-made, well-written comic because everything that goes on in it has to do with the development of the characters. The main character, Trace, is what is called the Grand Templar, and he's apparently completely sadistic and psycho and has everything against the animal characters in the series that are referred to as K-Dron. Problem is, close to the beginning of the comic, he lost his memory, has no idea who he is. So he doesn't remember all of his prejudices and ends up falling in love with a K-Dron girl named Flora. Unfortunately, the rest of the world knows who he is, knows what kind of life he's led, and knows what he's done. So everywhere he goes, he's dealing with a lot of different trouble and trauma because every time he shows up somewhere, people are like, "Ah, it's the Grand Templar, let's get him!" Ah! I like this comic simply because the artwork in it just pulls you in. And then the writing works so well, it's well paced, and it feels right for what you're seeing. It's something that you really come across a lot in well-made indie comics, okay? Because it does things differently than what your mainstream paper comics would do. Another good one is called MA3. It's actually got a completely different title, but I'd rather not use the full title here just so I don't have any issues because this is still a family-friendly channel. I don't want to suggest anything that would not be good for young people to read. But the reason I mention it is because oftentimes webcomics artists, that's where they get their start and end up getting into mainstream stuff. The artist Giselle Lagasse has done a number of comics like Cool Cat Studio, Penny and Aggie, which is one of my favorites from the early to mid 2000s. I read that one religiously as well, and I was mad when it ended. She had also done a comic for a short period of time called Quilt Bag, which talks a lot about the LGBTQ community because the acronym that they use for the title of the comic also fits in that same place. It's easier to remember for me as well. I'd rather say quilt bag rather than LGBTQ because it just rolls off the tongue better. It's easier for me to relate to, and it deals with a lot of those same things in like a college setting with some of the characters from Penny and Aggie, which I thought was rather interesting. It was kind of a spiritual successor, and it worked really well. But when it comes to Giselle Lagasse's work, In addition to her own comics, she has done a number of other sets of artwork for Archie Comics. She's worked on a lot of mainstream Archie, Betty and Veronica. I think she was doing some of the work for Betty and Veronica recently. She did a comic called The Archies Meet the Ramones. And she did a lot of the cover artwork for a separate set of comics for Gem and the Holograms. I loved Gem and the Holograms as a kid. I was one of those boys that loved watching, watching cartoon shows that were targeted at girls. But it was more that I was into the way that it was made, and it was just on. So I started watching it, and then it just kind of became a fan, that kind of thing. It's something that happens. These days, it's not as common that a series is just targeted towards a certain demographic without thinking of any others. But back in the 80s, you could tell a show that was supposed to be for boys and a show that was supposed to be for girls, and oftentimes there was a lot of crossover. Like, for example, I loved G.I. Joe as a kid. I talked about that in one of my Mailbag Mondays, which, by the way, I do want to bring back, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do it anytime soon. I loved G.I. Joe. Loved watching it. It was a great show. But right around that same time of the morning, you would get She-Ra, you would get Rainbow Bright, you would get Strawberry Shortcake, stuff like that. And I would just watch. I didn't care. I freaking loved it. Another good example of that is Care Bears. Loved Care Bears. But that wasn't really supposed to be targeted towards me. Okay. Gem and the Holograms has made a major comeback as far as the comics. They are more body positive versions of the characters from the 80s and actually follows more of that story. And I was really excited when I found out about it. It came out around the same time as that travesty of a movie. Who was that for, by the way? I still don't know who that movie was supposed to be for. But it was one of those things that brought the whole thing full circle for me, because I did not realize that there were webcomic artists that were legit comic artists as well until I came across that. And surprisingly, it's more common than you would expect. Another one of the comics that I read a lot is called Raven's Dojo. It's done by, what is his name? I want to say his name's Aaron, not Aaron Diaz. Crap. Raven is his first name. I can't remember his last name right now. It'll come to me another time. I'll probably put the other name in the down low so you guys can read it. But the comic itself is ridiculous. Okay, it is so over the top. It's not even funny. But he ended up doing a short story for the 25th anniversary of Savage Dragon, which I thought was interesting, mostly because I didn't know Savage Dragon was a comic until I was an adult, but I used to watch the Savage Dragon animated series back in the mid-90s, so it was kind of interesting to see that come full circle as well. Webcomics in and of themselves are a great place for people to start if they're into drawing comics, but they want to build something up that's all their own. There are a lot of people who will do them for autobiographical reasons. Like there was one that I was reading about a woman basically discovering herself. She started out her teenage years as saying, you know what, I'm lesbian, this is who I am, this is how my life is, these are the kind of people I want to be with, this is the life I want to live. And then she met a guy that she fell in love with, and he became her future husband. She didn't know how to deal with those feelings for a long time, so she just sat and drew it out. The comic is called Dar, and the subtitle is A Girly Webcomic, which I thought was pretty interesting. Another comic that was in that same vein is called Go Get a Roomie, which I stopped reading for a long time, and I'm happy that it's still running, but it's so far into the future on me, I have to go back and check it out some more just to figure out where things have gone, because I've missed so much in it. But that's another thing about webcomics. A lot of times there's no set schedule. There are some people who will release on certain days, like there are some people who do a daily comic, like for example Retail, because it's a newspaper comic, so they have the normal deadlines, but it runs daily. Okay, then you have people who do 5-day-a-week comics, like Questionable Content is, where it's Monday to Friday, but then on the weekends there's no updates. Then you'll have comics like Girl Genius by Phil and Kaja Folio. When I tell you this comic is gorgeous, that doesn't do it enough justice. The artwork from this is insane. This is more of a steampunk type comic about Agatha Clay, whose name is actually Agatha Heterodyne. Her father was part of a dynasty of amazing mad scientists that unfortunately destroyed so much of the world, but he and his younger brother were the first ones in the line that were actually kind of heroes, and they didn't want his daughter to be tainted by their past, so they gave her up for adoption. They changed her name, didn't tell her who she was, and actually gave her a necklace to dampen some of her intelligence so that she had no real understanding of where she came from. This is a 3 times a week comic, but they'll often do specials where they're, 5 days a week, things like that. It is such an interesting setup because this is a completely independent thing. In addition to making their own comics, they have graphic novel versions of everything that they have online. They also have special versions of things they sell for themselves. They do art books, they do plushes as well, because there's a couple of creatures that they had in the comic that they made plush versions of. Then there's the little action figures that they do. They made figure kits for what are called clanks. They're small robots that Agatha built over time, and you can build one and have one on your desk, which I think is pretty interesting. But you'll have webcomic artists who basically break into it as a business, and then that builds up, how they run things for themselves. Another good one is Sister Claire. This is another one of the multimedia type things that I've got going on. They have 2 series that are running concurrently at this point. Sister Claire, which is the webcomic, which is done twice weekly. It's done on Monday and Friday. And they have what is called Missing Moments, which started in probably about 2 or 3 years into the webcomic and fills in the gaps of things that are happening in the comic. For example, one of the stories that's running right now talks about a character named Hannah, who shows up in the comic for a very brief moment. We see her from from time to time at first, and now she's starting to come back now. But there was really not much said about her. Missing Moments filled in all of her backstory. Everything that we needed to know up until the time she shows up in the comic shows up in Missing Moments. We get to find out who she is, why she's doing what she's doing, and how her motivation came to be the way it is. The fact that the 2 series run concurrently, they run together, they work together, but they're not the exact same series. They deal with different parts of the same universe, essentially, but they are written differently, they're done differently, the artwork is done slightly differently, and they fit together in a way that works for the way the comic is written, but isn't a separate thing. So it becomes interesting and makes you want to come back for more, because the comic on Monday will, further the comic story. Then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, you get written stories that kind of fill in the blanks to give you a little bit more backstory on what might be happening in the comic, but it's never directly associated with it. It's not like, oh, just in case you wanted to know what's happening right now, here you go. Oftentimes, it's background on the character or characters that are in the comic for Monday, and then after those 3 written stories are done, on Friday we get another comic page that furthers the story from the comic, and it usually ties into what's going on in the actual comic. Webcomics in and of themselves are so interesting to me because there's so much you can do with them, and I've seen how far people can take them. I actually came across one that was interactive, for lack of a better way of describing it. For example, you would read parts of the comic, and there would be pieces that are clickable, that would bring up other things that were going on that would give you further backstory. There would be a couple of pages that are done in Flash where you can go and explore around them, which was really interesting. But because of the ambition of that, the artist ended up ending the comic, which was kind of painful. But the fact still remains that it's something that's really interesting to me to see that a person can take their art form to its logical extremes and make something really interesting. Webcomic artists are inspiring to me because I used to draw as a kid. I wanted to be a character designer when I was a teenager. And I didn't really put the effort in because I didn't think I would be able to, really make anything of it because I wasn't really all that great. But then I see webcomic artists who pretty much started the way that I started, just doodling in notebooks or, drawing on their school books as kids. And they developed it into something that was interesting for people to read. And it just keeps me coming back for more, being able to see that somebody who did the same thing I used to do as, a teenager, would make something beautiful. They would take something that I would have done when I was younger, and they took it to the next level. I think that's part of the reason why I like being a YouTuber as well, because it's taking something that I already did and taking it to the next level. I still talk about comics and video games and things like that with my friends. It's something that I do anyway, so why not film it sometimes? Why not try and make something interesting? Why not share with the world what's in my head? Because there's a lot of things that I say to people, a lot of things that I talk to with people, but there's also a bunch of stuff that I never really shared with anybody that I think is interesting to talk about. So instead of keeping it to myself, I figure, why not? So I sit in front of a camera and I talk to you. I really do hope that any of the people who are watching my channel who find themselves, interested in something, decide to go after it. When I did my first video, which was a reaction to Spider-Man Homecoming, it was literally me saying, you know what, I want to talk about this. I don't have anything better to do. I just want to talk about this. And hopefully other people want to talk about it too. You know? So I spend some time in front of a camera just talking about how I felt about Spider-Man. And it parlayed itself into, a channel where I sit and I talk about different things, and I dress up like an idiot and I get excited about different things, and hopefully it's something that entertains the people that watch. You know, there are currently about 70 of you that are watching my videos that are checking things out, and I really do hope that despite my sporadic updates lately, that the things that I'm putting up are entertaining. That what I'm, putting out for you is something that is interesting to you. I'm going to keep doing everything that I can to make an interesting channel. I'm going to try and do rants like this, although I'm not going to try and make it this long because we're approaching half an hour and it's just been me talking about comics that I read online. But I do want to keep doing videos for you, I want to keep talking about things that people are interested in. And I really do want to expand my horizons a little bit more. Yes, there are things I don't give a crap about, I'm not going to lie to you. But if it's something that you want me to talk about, I think that it's fair for me to give it a chance. So if you have something that you want me to talk about, leave a comment in the down low. Talk to me on Facebook, talk to me on Twitter, and now I have an Instagram, which is once again at home with a geek. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I'm out there as well. Links are going to be in the down low as well. Just let me know what's on your mind, because I let you guys know what's on my mind. You listen to me rant and rave about different stuff, so the least I can do is return the favor. But until next time, this is the little black dude. Stay geek and proud.